Their sergeant, a man from Ohio who had trained his men hard in Normandy rehearsals, kept checking flares they would never need in practice. His pistol was slick with seawater. Beside them, a medic, his medical bag patched and stenciled with a red cross, tried to find survivors under the lee of a wooden breakwater, calling names that no one could answer. The smell of cordite and diesel drifted under the salt air. The beach glimmered with twisted metal and abandoned equipment. Every few minutes, the surf returned a new wreckage of canvas and a boot or a gear bundle. Every few minutes, another voice called for a leader who would show the way. Engineers, trained for the art of breaking things that blocked advance, had their hands full. A man with the rank of sergeant had in his possession a Bangalore torpedo, a long tubular charge assembled to blow a hole through wire entanglements. He and his put-up team groped forward. Each step was measured against a machine gun sweep. They worked on their bellies or on knees, spliced sections of tube, lit a short fuse, and in a puff of smoke, watched a clockwork plan fail as the charge was shredded by shrapnel before it reached the wire. Nearby, a platoon lieutenant from the 29th Division tried to organize men into waves, but each wave either broke against the fire or melted into cover, as if the beach itself were a claim that refused to be surrendered. Amid this faltering, Kota moved. He did not carry the formal accoutrements of staff distance. Instead, he walked among the men, in the mud and smoke, looking for someone to hold and amplify the will to move. He spoke rarely, and when he spoke, it was with a directness that respected the gravity of the scene. He understood that if the first small teams could be seen climbing the bluffs and vanishing among the rocks and scrub, the rest might find the courage to follow. Without such visible antecedents, units on the sand tended to freeze. Orders could be given from a map table, but momentum was won with feet and voices and the sight of a leader ahead of danger. At one moment, Kota came upon a group of bewildered officers gathered behind a seawall. Their faces were chalked with salt. Their plans had been shredded by the reality of having to cross open sand under automatic weapons. They argued, measured options, and then argued some more, losing time as the tide kept changing. Kota took the problem out of the abstract. He stripped off his helmet, squared his shoulders, and climbed the ladders he had brought with him. He threaded gaps in the obstacles and moved up onto open sand. He signaled, took a rapid count of men who would dare follow, and walked for the bluffs. The image that circulated among those who were there was not of a general shouting from behind, but of a man who walked forward and expected others to come. That visible act mattered more than any formal order that morning.
Soldiers who had held their breath on the sand, who had convinced themselves that the plan had failed irreparably, now saw a way through the terror. Men began to rise, to form ragged columns behind him, to make for the broken shingle and the rocks that led up from the beach. Some were officers who then regained their authority through movement. Some were privates with an almost animal need to survive and the courage to try. What followed was not a single cinematic charge, but a sequence of improvisations that compounded. Small teams moved, found partial ledges, and began clearing out a casemate or two with grenades and close-quarters work. Engineers, finding an opening, used their detonations to create lanes through tangled wire. An individual sergeant would take a handful of men, swing left or right under cover, and over time, a path connected the waterline to one of the narrow exits cut into the bluff. This was not the clean, mechanized advance that training had promised. It was a series of human solutions to mechanical problems. Men using ladders, not because doctrine said so, but because a boat's ramp could be lashed to a concrete embankment and used as an improvised gangway. German resistance, for all its initial intensity, was not infinite. Their positions had been designed to deny a man the easiest progress. They had fields of fire that intersected and could pour death across a few yards of sand. But they were not omnipotent. Once the first lane opened, once a mortar pit or a machine gun nest was neutralized by a handful of attackers or by naval gunfire finding a new line, defenders found themselves dealing with threats from multiple directions they had not fully anticipated. Ammunition was finite. Confusion and the fog of battle set in. Radio contact among German positions was not perfect. Small, isolated crews could not always coordinate effective overwatch. A few decisive seizures of key emplacements created reverberations. One bunker knocked out, one flanking movement that forced a gun to cease fire. These cascaded into broader opportunities. That cascade was exactly what Kota understood he must initiate. Leadership that morning meant absorbing the immediate risk for the sake of creating a psychological and tactical opening. He encouraged junior officers to act, to give granular commands, rather than wait for a staff order that might never arrive. He shouted across the sand to non-commissioned officers, asking blunt questions about where men could find shelter and how engineers might make a lane. He refused to be bound by the imagination of the plan. He insisted that men improvise. In doing so, he accepted the litany of small failures that would accompany such improvisation. Lost lives, misfires, chaotic moments, because the alternative was paralysis and death in the shallows. Among the vignettes that emerged were a dozen small acts that together knitted a beachhead.
A corporal from a Midwestern town used a section of abandoned ramp to help men scale a seawall. An engineer sergeant fashioned a shorter Bangalore by removing damaged sections so it could be manhandled under machine gun fire. A medic with no cover strapped bandages to his chest and went back and forth between the wounded and a sheltered crevice where makeshift triage could be done. A lieutenant who had never expected to be a platoon commander in such circumstances found an innate steadiness, directing fire and calling for smoke to mask a movement. These stories were not romanticized heroics. They were small, ragged human efforts stitched into a larger will to survive. The tide of the day did not swing in a single moment. There was not a single hour after which all was secure. Rather, the day was a gradual accumulation of gains. Kota's action and the behavior he modeled changed the beach from a place of frozen survival to a scene of organized desperation. Men moving in small columns, covering fire shifting, engineers creating more lanes. Naval gunfire corrected aim and, over hours, began to reach previously untouched casemates. Reinforcements and more capable elements of the assault force, including armor that had survived the crossing, moved in where they could. The beach, which had been a trap for many in the early hours, slowly became a route for more men and material to flow inland. The cost was severe. Official reports and later historical estimates put the American casualties on Omaha Beach on D-Day into the thousands. Official counts varied, and consolidation of records took time. Approximately 2,000 to 2,400 American casualties at Omaha are commonly cited by historians, though numbers differ by source and by category: killed, wounded, missing. Those figures represented sons and fathers from towns across the United States, medics who had tried to lay hands on the wounded, and officers who had sought to hold formations together.
The human consequence was immediate and long-lasting. Field hospitals overflowed, supply schedules were adjusted, and the raw grief of loss threaded through units that would continue to fight for weeks and months after Normandy. Strategically, however, the stakes had always been larger than any single beach. If Omaha had failed utterly, the Allied lodgment in Normandy would have been in severe jeopardy. An annihilated force on that sector would have left a dent in the flank and endangered the cohesion of the invasion. By establishing footholds, however tenuous, and by opening lanes for reinforcements and supplies, Omaha became part of a continental gateway. The lodgment that began on D-Day evolved into a network of routes by which men and material poured into France, eventually enabling operations to secure ports like Cherbourg and to sustain an Allied advance across Europe.
The domestic and human cost of those gains did not diminish the gravity of the decisions made that morning. It merely contextualized why the improvised courage on a single beach had consequences beyond immediate survival. Cota's personal legacy emerged in two intertwined ways, the practical and the symbolic. Practically, his insistence on visible leadership, on moving forward in person and compelling others to follow, hardened into doctrine taught by veterans later in the war. Small unit initiative, the importance of leaders not merely issuing orders but creating momentum, became lessons that filtered into training. Symbolically, Cota became one of the faces of Omaha, a human anchor in retellings of the battle. Veterans remembered a general who had walked the sand with them, who used blunt words to shake men out of paralysis, who refused to allow the plan's failure to become a reason to stop fighting. Official accounts noted his actions. Later history cited how his movement helped thaw the dangerous immobility that had gripped portions of the first waves. Yet the story of Omaha is not reducible to a single man's courage. It is a layered account of planning errors, of logistical improvisation, of individual bravery, and of institutional resilience. The naval bombardment had failed to do everything hoped. The armor flotilla had been imperfectly deployed. But in the vacuum created by those failures, men on the ground, officers, NCOs, enlisted, found solutions. Some of those solutions were codified later. Some never would be. What remained was the memory of a morning when leadership was not only a matter of rank, but of visibility and willingness to share danger. As the hours wore on and the sand cooled under the British and American boots, medics moved to more organized aid stations. Stretchers were laid under tarps. Supply dumps began to accumulate. Engineers turned their attention from immediate breaching to stabilizing exits and preparing for convoys. Towns like Vierville and Colville, which stood a short distance inland, would later receive the first shocked ambulances and field hospitals, and their churches and halls would become temporary shelters or morgues. For every advantage gained, there remained the paperwork of war. Casualty reports to assemble, replacements to feed into shattered units, maps redrawn to reflect ground actually held rather than planned positions. In the months and years that followed, the narrative of D-Day and of Omaha would be told in many ways. Some accounts stressed the cost and the waste. Others emphasized the logistical triumph of landing a force under fire. Veterans' voices lent texture to the telling. The medic who recalled a lull in the gunfire that allowed him to press a bandage into a boyish hand.
The engineer who spoke quietly of the smell of burning cordite and the relief of seeing a lane through the wire. The private who could not forget the face of the first man he helped pull over the seawall.
Coda's action was not the only reason survival and success occurred, but it was the kind of catalytic detail history remembers. A leader turning immobility into motion by the deliberate choice to be where the danger was most visible. By the time the fighting moved off the beach and deeper into the bocage country of Normandy, the significance of that first day was already clear to those who had been there. Securing Omaha meant not only that men had made it inland, it meant that a permanent corridor for men, supplies, and armor existed where there might otherwise have been only a linear grave. The logistical implications were substantial. A secure Omaha allowed the Allies to land greater numbers of troops and equipment on the American sectors of the invasion front, thereby reducing the strain on the British and Canadian beaches to the east. It contributed to the larger operational goal of consolidating a Western front that could project the Allied force into France and beyond. In later years, historians would sift through logs, after-action reports, and veterans' testimonies to render a fuller account of what happened on that shore. They would note that the initial naval and aerial plan had limitations, that intelligence had underestimated the dispositions of German divisions, that weather had played a cruel hand, and that leaders at all levels had to improvise under fire. They would also note that the human cost could not be washed away by strategic success. Towns mourned sons, families received telegrams, returning veterans carried memory and scar. Commemoration would follow, plaques, ceremonies, museum exhibits, but these could never fully repay the debt owed to those who had given the morning of June 6th to a cause larger than themselves. August and September would bring other battles and other tests of leadership. Normandy would become a grinding series of advances and setbacks through bocage and hedgerow. Yet, in the narrative of how Allied forces established a foothold in continental Europe, the image of a general walking the sand and the small improvisational acts that followed remained an essential thread. It was a reminder that military theory meets a chaotic human reality at the waterline, and that the difference between death and momentum, between being pinned and pressing forward, often rested on decisions made in the visible presence of danger. As the day closed on that first night, survivors lay in shallow foxholes, shivering with exhaustion and trauma. Some soldiers wrote brief letters to loved ones in pockets of coffee cups and wet packs. Others simply stared at the stars and tried to imagine what home would look like when the war finally ended. In the quiet between shell bursts, medics counted what they could. Engineers cursed at twisted metal that would later be reclaimed. And commanders tried to knot the loose ends of units into sustainable formations. The immediate sense was one of brittle relief. A toehold had been taken, but the price had been exacted. Norman Coda's name would appear in official reports and in the recollections of men who owed their survival in part to seeing someone walk forward. He would continue his military career after the war and be remembered as an officer who understood that leadership meant presence and practical action as much as orders. For the soldiers whose faces he saw that morning, and for the families who later read the casualty lists, his act was woven into a larger fabric of sacrifice and improvisation that defined the landings. The memory of Omaha remained hard and necessary, a place where planning met a violent reality, and where the will of men and leaders bent the outcome. The beach itself, once a strip of chaos and ruin, became over time a place of memorials and quiet stones. Visitors would later walk its sands in peace, measure the scarred bluffs with their hands, and read the names engraved there. But those stones could not speak for the living men who had moved, bled, and worked in the hours between dawn and dusk. They only marked that something had been paid and something had been changed. If this account stirred you, consider showing your support. Like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, or if you have a family connection to these events. Your engagement helps keep careful history alive and honors those who stood at the waterline. In the first weeks that followed, the beachhead matured into a strange, grinding economy of war. Where dawn on June 6th had produced a furious, kinetic moment, men in surf, steel, smoke, and blood, the days that followed required a different sort of tenacity, the patient, often inglorious labor of making gains stick. Engineers pushed inland, clearing mines and creating routes across the churned sand and broken revetments. Truck columns, at first tentative and scattered, learned to find their way past shell-cratered approaches and through fields that still bore the signs of shattered equipment and lost lives. Naval gunfire and the occasional airstrike continued to sweep the bluffs, but the most persistent enemy in those days was the terrain itself. Narrow lanes hemmed by high hedgerows, shallow lanes of bocage that turned the countryside into a maze of ambush and frustration. Reinforcements arrived in waves that felt at once miraculous and maddeningly slow. Lighters and pontoon ferries and the stubborn ambition of the Mulberry Harbor projects gave the Allies the capacity to unload more than ammunition and rations. They brought bulldozers, bulldog tanks, engineers' bridging equipment, fuel, and the spare parts without which machinery simply stopped. The idea of a landing that would become a frontable, functional base relied on these mundane elements: pipes, bulldozers, teeth of treads biting into mud, more than on any single act of heroism. Still, it was the combination of both that transformed a blood-stained shoreline into a corridor for armies. At night, the fields and lanes told different stories. Skeletal fires burned as small groups of men gathered, trading cigarettes, news from other sectors, and sometimes the names of comrades who had not made it to morning. Letters were written in the margins of ration cards, cursive scratched by hands that had never been steadier or that trembled with exhaustion. A medic in a dugout would rifle through his pack and find a photograph pressed between bandages, two young faces smiling at a summer fair, and for a few minutes the world outside the foxhole receded. Others sat awake, listening for the familiar cough of a distant mortar, and thought of home as a kind of unrecoverable country. Not just one place, but a set of habits and voices and rooms that the war had already altered beyond recognition. Commanders measured success differently. For some, a secured crossroads or a repaired bridge meant the difference between supply lines that would hold and a stalled advance that invited counterattack.
For others, the measure was human and immediate, keeping a depleted company together long enough to accept replacements, getting wounded men aboard a hospital ship for the transatlantic journey, persuading frightened, dispersed platoons to cross an orchard under artillery fire. These acts, some tactical, some pastoral, became the texture of leadership in Normandy, a mixture of planning and improvisation, maps and face-to-face persuasion. The German defenses, once the impression of impregnable fortifications, glimmered in a harsher light as weeks passed. Pockets of resistance remained stubborn, isolated strongpoints in farmhouses, machine gun nests in sunken lanes, artillery crews who had refused to yield their positions. Yet the Allied advantage in numbers, in mobility, and above all in command of the air, gradually narrowed the German options. Reconnaissance flights by day and artillery spotters by night cut into the enemy's ability to redeploy freely. The Luftwaffe, stretched and depleted on multiple fronts, could no longer impose the kind of air superiority the Germans had exercised in earlier campaigns. Still, these strategic realities could not erase the daily toll. Casualty lists continued to arrive, and with them the mechanical rituals of grief. Telegrams delivered to stoic doorways, chaplains offering last rites in a drawn-out cadence that made the world itself seem smaller, and funeral parties carried out with the solemn precision of ceremony. Wounded soldiers who would eventually return home often carried shame as much as pain, a guilt that they had survived when others had not. And veterans' conversations in years to come would be threaded with the same awkwardness. How to speak of bravery without sounding as if one had been chosen for it. How to hold the memory of friends without turning it into a spectacle.
A few episodes from those weeks became emblematic, not because they altered the strategic map, but because they shaped how men understood one another. Small unit commanders who led by example, soldiers who refused to leave a wounded comrade behind, engineers who worked through the night to clear a road. All these acts stitched together the fragile fabric of trust necessary for any advance. Where planning met chaos, the moral economy of the battlefield, who stayed, who carried, who rallied, became as decisive as the placement of guns. Beyond the immediate fighting, the Allied staff began to tackle the larger arithmetic of what a campaign in France would require. Supply lines had to be extended, depots established, the movement of armor coordinated with infantry advances so that tanks could exploit gaps rather than become trapped in narrow lanes. Medical evacuation routes were mapped with painful care. The command question was no longer merely how to land soldiers, but how to keep them fighting over weeks and months, through rain and mud, through the close, suffocating hedgerows that ate men one field at a time. In the towns that lay beyond the beaches, civilians emerged from cellars and basements to a landscape both familiar and foreign. Houses were half ruined or pocked by shrapnel. Barns stood with their facades blown away. Yet local men and women, exhausted by years of occupation, offered what help they could. Guides who knew the lanes and the hidden fords. Farmers who traded bread for services. Villagers who together collected the dead and buried them with rites that were private and raw. These small acts of cooperation, gestures of survival more than celebration, created uneasy and sometimes heroic alliances of convenience.
Language barriers were bridged with gestures and the universal currency of shared human need. As July settled in, talk among the ranks turned toward the next phase. Rumors of operations to break out of Normandy circulated with the same unreliable currency as weather forecasts, half wishful, half skeptical. Soldiers who had become proficient at close fighting in hedgerows longed for wider fields where armored units could maneuver, while planners worked to create just such opportunities. The idea of a push, concentrated, overwhelming, and rapid, began to take shape on staff maps, but it would require months of preparation, concentrations of artillery, stockpiles of fuel, synchronized air support, and an ability to exploit any success before German forces could recover. Personal stories threaded through these broader movements. A young corporal who had lost his best friend on Omaha taught himself to read the letters that arrived for the unit because he had better handwriting and the men trusted him to speak truths gently.
A French priest whose church had been struck by shellfire found himself ministering not only to his flock but to soldiers from several nations, reciting a prayer in stilted English after Mass and accepting the shared grief that war made oddly ecumenical. An engineer sergeant wrote in his diary about the grotesque beauty of the shore at dawn. Broken steel, gulls wheeling over twisted landing craft, then crossed out the line for fear that sentiment might betray him. Amid these smaller scenes, the operational picture shifted. The Allies tightened their hold on key exits from the beaches and sought to link the disparate lodgements into a continuous front. Patrolling became more aggressive. Artillery barrages were timed with infantry movements to reduce exposure during advances through the bocage. Combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, air, began to function with greater coordination, though never perfectly. At the staff level, the language of logistics grew sharper. Tonnage required per day, scheduled arrival times, the sequencing of fuel and munitions. The theater of war demanded paperwork with a moral dimension. Late or missing supplies could be measured in lives. By the end of July, the familiar tactical rhythms had codified into a routinized intensity. The front lines in Normandy did not resemble the open blitzes of earlier campaigns. Rather, they were a series of bites and consolidations. The breakout that many had hoped for remained a dangerous promise, possible but dependent on a confluence of advantage that had yet to fully materialize. Still, each small gain, an orchard seized at dawn, a village cleared before nightfall, a river bridge repaired under fire, carried weight. The men who made those gains understood that momentum once earned could be amplified. They also understood the precariousness. Missteps and delays could turn success into a costly stalemate. As summer deepened, the landscape itself seemed to remember that a conflict had passed through. Fields with lingering shell craters, hedgerows reduced to stumps, orchards that would not bear fruit that year. Yet, pockets of peace were possible. There were mornings when a breeze off the channel carried the smell of salt and hay, and for a few hours a soldier might allow himself to believe that the worst was behind him. Those moments of quiet, rare and fragile, were not effectively safe, but they were holy in their own way. Men wrote home, sometimes with the cautious optimism of survivors checking their good fortune, sometimes with the blunt honesty of those who had seen too much. Behind this human tableau was the larger strategic clock. Higher commands were already thinking beyond Normandy, about the push across France, about linking with other fronts, about the political imperatives that would follow military success.
The liberation de towns and the movement of refugees would pose questions of governance and order. The Allied forces could not simply fight their way forward and leave jurisdictional chaos in their wake. Yet, in the immediate present, such concerns were subordinate to the imperative of survival and tactical advance. For the infantryman in a hedgerow, the future remained a distant geography whose borders were unknown. In quiet moments of reflection, some officers would return to the sand of Omaha in their minds, not to glorify, but to study. The landing taught lessons that would be carried forward: the need for flexible leadership, the importance of small unit initiative, the limits of intelligence when faced with chaotic realities, and the moral responsibility that accompanied orders to advance under fire. Norman Cota's walk across that sand had been, in at least one telling, emblematic of a style of command that preferred presence to abstraction. Whether it could be replicated, and how best to train for the unpredictable humanity of war, were questions that would haunt doctrinal debates in the months and years to come. For now, however, doctrine mattered less than the next day and the next mile. Preparations for the larger operations already discussed were underway. Stockpiles were gathered, reconnaissance probes increased, and liaison between Allied national forces intensified. Men repaired what could be repaired, buried what must be buried, and readied themselves to move off the coast and into the deeper, uncertain country that lay ahead. The sea, which had been at once a barrier and a lifeline, receded behind them as they turned inland toward a northern summer that promised advantage and asked for more price. Night fell on another camp, and with it the low chorus of murmured prayers, whispered names, and the mechanics of rest. Somewhere, an officer revised a map. Somewhere else, a band of engineers laughed quietly as they finished a job that had seemed impossible at dawn. In the quiet interval before the next push, those small human acts, repairing a boot, sharing a canteen, smoothing a blanket over a hard place, bound the weary army together. They were, in their own way, acts of strategy as much of mercy. Without them, no front could hold, and without them, no advance could be sustained. And so the Allied effort continued, a mixture of grand design and stubborn detail, of planning and improvisation, of memory and forward motion. The beaches had been taken. The work of making that success endure stretched ahead like a road through the hedgerows, demanding patience, courage, and the kind of small, unheroic heroism that the stones on the shore could not fully record. In the months to come, some moments would become chapters in the histories, others only private memories. But together they would form the next phase of a campaign that would decide much of Europe's fate.
Dawn after dawn, the routine continued. Men rose with the light and the same small ceremonies of readiness, scraping grit from boots, checking rifles, rebandaging old wounds because new ones were inevitable. The maps on the officers' tables grew crowded with pins and inked lines. A regional picture emerged that was at once promising and maddening. Gaps to be widened, enemy concentrations to be dispersed, roads to be cleared of mines and sabotage. Commanders spoke in measured phrases that tried to bend the chaos into an order the world could understand. Consolidate the beachhead, secure the flank, push to the river. Behind those phrases were sleepless calculations about fuel, rations, ammunition, and the wear of men who had already done more than their share. Reconnaissance patrols became the new vanguard of information. At night, slender figures slipped between hedgerows, whispering into the dark with the practiced caution of those who had learned to trust sight over rumor. They brought back details that would not appear on any high map. The smell of a farmhouse after it had been emptied, the way a particular lane tended to funnel rain into a ford, the sight of a child's drawing nailed to a barn door as if it offered protection. Those tidbits shaped decisions as surely as the large-scale reports from brigade and corps. Close to the front, the war was decided in particulars. Engineers moved with a deliberation that was a different sort of courage. Where high command spoke of roads and supply, the engineers touched the ground to make those abstractions true. They bridged shell-pocked streams, repaired culverts, and took apart damaged tractors to cannibalize their parts for something else. At times they laughed, hard, small laughs, after a day when a bridge rose that should not have, when a wire snagged and a mechanism turned. The laughter kept a balance between despair and the steady hope that things could, with patience, be set right. In the medical stations, as always, held a particular weather of their own. Men who had been stoic on nights and laughter in daylight would fall apart in the cold, bright light of the tent. The surgeons worked with a combination of skill and grim improvisation, setting bones, stanching flow, and tracing faint lines of infection that threatened survival. There were days when more men came in than could be stitched into a neat schedule. Other days were quieter and allowed for the small mercies, clean bandages, an extra blanket, a voice reading a letter aloud, because the man who had written it couldn't read what he had returned. Nurses, often unsung, held the line between life and the shape that followed. The civilians whose homes lay between the hedgerows and the roads bore their own catalogue of losses and adaptations. Where a German billet had been, a family might return to find their cow gone and the stove smashed. Where an orchard once promised apples, a fatherless field lay stripped.
Yet among those tragedies there were gestures of resilience. A woman sweeping the threshold with a broom taken from a charred room. Children who learned to move through the ruins as though they belonged to them. And neighbors who offered what little food they had. The soldiers learned to accept these gestures, quiet hospitality proffered across language and the gulf of uniform. Small exchanges, an apple, a cigarette, a foreign word learned and repeated, became brief liturgies of normalcy. At brigade level, the talk turned to the next imperative. The breakout that would translate the hard-won lodgment into a directional advance. There were arguments about timing. Some argued that the enemy, though battered, would still be capable of scattering counterattacks if they were allowed to regroup. Others insisted that delay would give the Germans a chance to concentrate their armored forces and close the narrow apertures that presently existed. Reconnaissance suggested that in certain sectors the enemy lines had thinned. At others, they remained dense and well-sighted. The air commanders, whose bombing had been both boon and controversy, were consulted. They had learned, too, the hazard of imprecision. Where the carpeted fires had struck close to friendly lines, there had been bitter recriminations. Finding a window in which artillery,
armor, infantry, and aviation could move in rough concert had become the problem of the moment. Conversations about combined arms had once been the province of manuals and staff schools. Now they were the substance of life. Tank crews learned to trust the infantry flanking their advance. Infantry learned to read the tank tracks and to know when they must press the hedgerows to protect metal machines from anti-tank teams hidden in the warren of green. Air support, when it arrived, had to thread a narrow seam between friendly positions and enemy entrenchments. When the seam held, seams of territory opened up like doors. When it did not, the cost could be immediate and terribly visible. In quieter moments, officers tried to keep the morale ledger balanced. A rousing speech could not supply missing shells, nor could a reprimand undo the damage of a failed flanking attempt. The better leaders, those who moved among the men, did not rely on rhetoric alone. They brought hot coffee, inquired about letters, and accepted blame when plans failed. Norman Cota's example, the man who had walked Omaha's sand, hung in those conversations less as myth, but as a practical lesson. Presence mattered. Men took heart when they saw someone who would stand beside them in bad weather. Intelligence, too, was a human art in those days. Intercepts and reconnaissance photographs told one part of the truth. Captured documents and the testimony of prisoners filled in the rest.
There were surprises. Units that had been thought destroyed reconstituted in the night. Supply depots discovered tucked into old barns. And the silent knowledge that a river's ford might be shifted by recent rains. Some intelligence came from unusual sources. A resistance cell down a lane that had once been silent. A priest who knew which house had harbored fugitives. A farmer whose knowledge of the earth prevented an ambush. Liaison with French informants grew deeper. Wherever the local networks were strong, the Allied advance found its outline. The political officers in staff meetings spoke of the broader consequences of movement. Liberation would bring with it governance questions. Who would police towns? Who would manage distribution of food? How to prevent looting and vengeance? The soldiers on the ground answered these questions day by day with deeds. Holding a line at a market to prevent disorder. Setting up an ad hoc tribunal when reprisals threatened to spiral. And sometimes, disastrously, leaving locals to wrestle alone with the consequences. There was no neat template for the liberated town. The moral complexity of occupation and liberation marched alongside the tactical realities. A particular episode crystallized those tensions. A week into the inland advance, a small village at a crossroads changed hands twice in a single day. In the first hour, the liberators entered to meet jubilant faces and the smell of stew. The local schoolteacher, who had kept a ledger of the town's losses, offered the commander an account of what the Germans had taken. The troops began to distribute rations, and for a brief while, order and gratitude meshed. Then, in the late afternoon, a German counterparty, elements of a withdrawn company, suddenly struck from a hedgerow that had been misread in the reconnaissance report. Men died in the narrow lanes. A baker's shop went up in flame. The liberators fell back with difficulty, and later returned with armor and artillery. When the smoke cleared, the town lay in a different posture. Gratitude still there for liberation, but the reality of sudden loss fresh and raw. The evening's ledger included not just the familiar tally of enemy killed and prisoners taken, but also the moral weight of how liberators must also be guardians.
For those who managed the flow of supply, the challenge of movement was relentless. Convoys crept along lanes scarred by shell fire, drivers alert for the flash of a wire or the glint of a trap. A stalled truck could create a choke that starved the front. Where the engineers had not yet made a lane secure, a supply train might be rerouted for days, a delay that translated into hungry men and idle guns. Fuel was the measure of mobility. Where it ran low, command decisions curdled. A promised attack was postponed. An armored column that might have proven decisive sat idle.
The administrative corps handled these calculations with a combination of arithmetic and faith. Without either, the front could not go on. There were also acts of discipline that kept the army humane. Courts-martials in the rear handled infractions, sometimes in cases where men, frayed by fatigue, committed theft from civilians, or worse. When crimes were proven, the penalties were enforced with a sobriety intended to preserve the fragile goodwill with the population. Officers understood that reputation mattered as much as victories. It shaped whether towns would feed troops or hide them. Conversations in the mess tents alternated between maps and the pre-war lives men had left behind. A corporal would mention a farm that once produced the best strawberries in his county. Another would recall a sister who had married late and managed a shop. Those recollections sustained them. Letters arrived irregularly. A single envelope could be read and reread until the ink smudged. The men developed small rituals to manage absence. A fiddler in one unit who knew 3 airs could lift a room's mood for an hour. Elsewhere, men shared tobacco in a way that made little acts of generosity necessary, even without much to give. As the calendar approached the chosen day for a concentrated assault to widen the lodgment, the tempo increased. Artillery units rehearsed barrages, careful to ensure timing that would precede and protect the infantry's move. Medical detachments scouted forward locations for field dressing stations. Engineers prepared lanes wide enough for tanks, while others scouted flanking hedgerows for possible anti-tank nests. The airmen set aside sorties for close support. The mechanics worked at dawn on aircraft that bore the heavy burdens of precision. Briefings stretched late into night. Orders became less a forward command than a binding of disparate individuals into a single direction. On the evening before the operation, a hush settled in the camp that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with attention. Men checked equipment with slow hands, not for superstition, but because the quality of the moment demanded care. Chaplains moved among the men, offering quiet words. In some units, there were prayers muttered under breath. In the twilight, the field kitchens issued what tasted like feasts, and in the quiet, some sang low songs of home. The officers who had been calculating routes and timings now kept their focus on smaller responsibilities. Who would lead the first wave? Which flank would guard the column? And how to ensure that the wounded could be evacuated with speed. On the northern edge of the lodgment, an armored regiment massed on a slope that gave a long view of the countryside.
Este é o conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. Nearby, infantrymen sat on crates and wrote names in the dirt with the end of a stick, the old habit of imprinting a memory into ground that would not betray it. The sky, a low wash of late light, held no promise and no menace. It simply would be the sky under which men would test their fate. Orders were issued just before midnight. They were clear, taut as a rope. Movement at first light, a creeping barrage to mask the advance, flanking elements to clear the worst of the anti-tank positions, and, above all, the imperative to maintain momentum the instant a breach was achieved. Momentum, officers observed in a quiet aside, was not only a matter of ordnance and movement. It was a psychological pressure on an enemy who had to be denied the time to recompose. The man who would execute it received their instructions in the simple language that matters under stress. Objectives, rally points, signals, and the knowledge of who was to take charge if a leader fell. In the last hour before dawn, the camp breathed shallowly. Men lay awake thinking of small things, a mother's handwriting, the sound of rain on a roof, the taste of an orange in sunlight. Others prayed. A sergeant checked his pistol one last time, fingers moving out of habit over worn metal. The field telephones hummed with the last confirmations. Artillery zeroed, engineers on the ready, reconnaissance poised to push out first and assure the way. An old thunderhead in the distance promised weather that could change plans. The staff weighed the cost of postponement against the opportunity of surprise. When the first gray light stretched over the hedgerows, engines stirred. A column began to roll, slow and measured, a line of man and metal testing the morning. Breath tightened. The next hours would be a test of all the small acts that had accumulated. A stitch in uniform, an extra ration packed away, a letter read and folded with care. Those acts, woven into a broader material of maps and orders, would decide whether the beachhead became a corridor for advance or a place where men would merely linger. They moved out into the hedgerows, where the ground kept secrets and the air carried the smell of turned earth and distant smoke. Each man took his small measure of courage and placed it in his pocket beside his ration and his dog tags. The countryside welcomed them neither kindly nor cruelly. It simply received the footfalls, the tracks, the casualties, and the quiet prayers, and would keep those traces in its soil long after the shouting had ceased. For now, the immediate joy and dread belonged to those who stepped forward, and to those who watched maps by lamplight and prayed silently that their calculations would be true.